We've called this meeting because it's absolutely essential that there are peace talks and ceasefire, and we bring this war in Ukraine to an end. It's going to bring nothing but disaster if it continues. But in particular, we wanted to look at the fact that we and our media present a very narrow view of the world, kind of US, UK, Australia. The rest of the world maybe sees things very differently. Maybe there could be, a different approach to the way that the world, rather than militarisation, maybe the world could trade on a fairer basis. And we're here tonight to explore that alternative view, really what I would see as the majority of the world, not just this narrow US, NATO, UK interest that we see represented in our media. So for that reason, we've invited a number of speakers from different backgrounds. The first speaker tonight is Sarah Green, NEU rep.
Good evening, thanks very much for having me. Where there's war, there's profit. That's not new information to anyone. But the way it's presented is an essential part of our functioning as a society. It's insidious enough to have seen some of the most well-intentioned people calling for more NATO intervention in the case of Ukraine, despite its historically devastating impact. Yet Zelensky's PR team are working round the clock, featuring him and his wife on the cover of Vogue, whilst his citizens perish in a war zone, of which the manufacturing starts straight after the collapse of the USSR, Donbass being in critical situation since 2014. Meanwhile, as the UK continues to support further intervention in Ukraine, we're being attacked as unions through media rhetoric and anti-strike legislation set to be put to the Commons later this year. This is coming in response to the gargantuan coordinated action being carried out by unions across the public sector, with the RNC calculating a real terms pay cut of 20% since 2010, and teachers not having had an above inflation pay increase since 2006. All the while, the UK continues to profit from war in some of the most war-torn majority Muslim countries, in which far-right conservative groups have been propped up by the US government and by extension the UK as a useful bulwark against sovereignty from those places, in a material economic sense, as are simply too oil-rich. This bleeds into Eurocentric and frankly racist narratives. In 2010, the attack on Gaza by the IDF rightly annoyed anyone concerned with what is plainly an apartheid regime. However, I was told that I risked my job as a trainee teacher should I not remain quote-unquote impartial. A pupil in another school was consequently suspended after wearing a Palestinian badge as a show of solidarity. Compare this to the war in Ukraine, where schools are showing footage and appeals from Zelensky in personal development sessions and are even setting up fundraisers. A clear example of Western hypocrisy in the face of the wars that we help to create and maintain. If we don't point out this hypocrisy, we don't analyse its origins. It's only then that we realise why it is that we're able to spend billions on war, whilst the likes of posties, nurses, teachers and their families are being told that having more food banks than McDonald's is acceptable under this glorious democracy. Ultimately, the working class on either side of war is never the beneficiary. Zelensky and Sunak have both unleashed anti-strike legislation that demonstrates this clearly. When push comes to shove, profit prevails over poor lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent contribution. The next speaker we've got, I think it may be familiar to many of you, is a wonderful guest speaker that has contributed to many of our events in the past. Sami Ramadani, originally from Iraq, but also on the National Committee of Stop the War, journalist, lecturer, the list goes on. I'm just so pleased that he's here. Thank you, Sami.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here again, supporting Lewisham, Stop the War and CND. On the war in Ukraine, one thing I wanted to say is that we are living it today, while a lot of these massive events take years to properly understand and analyze. I mean, people are still debating the nature of World War I and World War II, and who started what and who benefited from that war. How did the Nazis come to power and their policies and so on. And people are still debating the War of the Roses, 15th century in England. So we are still, obviously, the events are unfolding. One complication is that any event of this magnitude has so many sides to it, so many angles. You can approach the war. You can approach it from the military standpoint, what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, economically, what are the economic consequences and ramifications of this war, what about the various alliances across the world, what about the domestic situation within the Ukraine, how did that contribute to the war, what about the domestic situation inside Russia itself in relationship to such a massive event on their borders with hundreds of thousands of their troops invading Ukraine. So you can go through an entire list. I've listed here about 20 different factors one can approach. I'm not going to go through them, so you can relax. But it's important that I will touch on some of these issues as we debate the question. Within the Ukraine, nearly a quarter of the population are Russians. And this immediately raises a number of questions. What does that mean? What happened to these ethnic Russians? Where do they live? Were they subjected to terror tactics and attacks? And tens of thousands of ethnic Russians died since 2014 through bombardment from the rest of Ukraine. The Crimea, until 1957, was part of the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation was one republic within the Soviet Union. So Russia today is that Russian Federation, which was part of the massive Soviet Union. And in 1957, for administrative reasons, Khrushchev, the then Soviet leader, decided that administratively the Crimea should be run from Kiev, from the rest of Ukraine. And the Crimea is so strategic to Russia, it literally makes Russia landlocked. If you take over the Crimea, it becomes landlocked towards the whole of Europe. Russia was invaded twice in the 20th century, and in both cases, especially World War II, they were invaded through the Ukraine. Ukraine became the massive German base to destroy Russia. So you don't need much propaganda, whether Putin-type propaganda or whoever, to frighten the Russian people that this is something existential for them. That Ukraine and the march of NATO into the Ukraine and the establishment of military bases to attack Russia. Moscow is literally 10 minutes by missile from Kiev to Moscow. So the existential threat to Russia was massive. And maybe I should add here that I do not support the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. I think it does violate international law, and I think it's morally wrong as well to deny the right of self-determination to the Ukrainian people. I'm trying to analyze and be objective as to what's going on, because our media blinds us. It is so frighteningly simplistic that even such dangerous developments as pushing the wall towards World War and nuclear conflagration is treated as something, you can mention it in 10 seconds in our news bulletins. And that is frightening for me, especially that the media now is united. There's no dissenting voice. The political scene, the establishment scene, Tory, Labour, Liberal, you name it, are united. It's quite frightening, this, because they are all preaching war. And if you talk about peace and negotiations, then you are now depicted as an extremist, a Putin supporter, a threat to the national security. And that, again, is a dangerous development, that alternative opinions are literally suppressed. To portray things that we are always the good guys And what we do abroad, we might make mistakes, we might make even horrific mistakes. The Iraq war is typically portrayed as a mistake, not a war of aggression that benefited the oil companies or the arms manufacturers, or that we were following the United States blindly. We were good. We wanted to remove Saddam, a brutal ruler, we all agree. But we messed up. It's all posed from the standpoint that our politics at the highest level is for the good, but they make mistakes. Same with the Suez War and the war against Egypt in 1956. France, Britain, and Israel invaded Egypt. That is also portrayed as a mistake rather than a war of aggression that had specific reasons that can be identified. It's not a coincidence today that the war in Ukraine, our politicians want to escalate, has generated massive profits. I thank Sarah for this. Where there is war, there is profit. BP, Shell, all the energy companies are making record profits that they have never ever made at that level. The arms manufacturers. So there are people actually making tens of billions of pounds from this war already, let alone the way they want to escalate it further. So we need to examine these things that are not communicated to us honestly, straightforwardly. And I get horrified listening to BBC Radio every morning, the Today program. They don't challenge any of these politicians. In fact, they tell them, why aren't we supporting Ukraine properly? Why aren't we giving them jets? Why aren't we sending more tanks? Why is Germany dragging its feet? So they are, in fact, the chief editors of the BBC are obviously telling these presenters to actually push the politicians towards saying, why aren't we doing enough? Rather than telling them, why aren't we negotiating? Could you tell us, please, how this war is going to end eventually? I just dug up an article, actually, before coming here, which was published in The Guardian of all places, in April 2014, written by the deputy editor of The Guardian, Seamus Milne. It is not Russia that's pushed Ukraine to the brink of war. And he's saying, Russia will never, ever give up the Crimea. These are Russian people there, and you will strangle Russia if you take over the Crimea, and Russia will intervene. And this is going to lead to war. And NATO is pushing us to a big war in Ukraine. This is 2014, and he wasn't alone, by the way. Some American academics, professors at universities also in 2014 warned against this escalation and the eventual war that will follow. They said it because they know the history of Ukraine. They said it because what NATO was doing, expanding towards the Russian borders. They converted most of the former Soviet republics into NATO members. What was left is that strategic underbelly of Russia, which is Ukraine. And significantly, all these analyses appeared in 2014 because there was a coup, a neo-Nazi fascist coup in Kiev. Parliament was meeting, an elected government of Ukraine. Parliament was meeting, and armed masked men stormed Parliament and forced all the members of Parliament to raise their arms to depose the elected president. And that was the coup of 2014. And the BBC itself at the time reported that there were neo-Nazi machine gun holders who stormed Parliament and executed that coup. And that coup was US supported, Europe was reluctant. So 2014, you cannot understand what is happening today without that coup of 2014 and the United States pushing the new regime in Ukraine to join NATO. They They actually were pushing them to apply to join. It wasn't even a domestic drive to join NATO. It wasn't that the Ukrainian people voted, let's join NATO, so that you say, okay, self-determination. And I don't know if you were familiar with the recent exposure by Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize winner, US journalist, through his Pentagon contacts, has exposed the fact that the United States actually blew up Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. Sweden established a committee to investigate the debris. The debris of the explosion was gathered by Sweden because it was in Swedish waters. They gathered it all. A technical Swedish committee investigated, and Sweden announced last week that they cannot reveal the results for security reasons. Our media is silent. How can you be silent towards such a massive event? And Germany itself, by the way, there are 50,000 soldiers, US soldiers. Germany is not allowed to act militarily anywhere without US say-so. Same goes with Japan. These are World War II arrangements whereby neither Germany or Japan are allowed to move their military outside their borders, not allowed to exceed certain budget limits, not allowed to develop nuclear weapons, etc., under World War II impositions, both for Japan and Germany. And now the United States is pushing both to militarize, to intervene, as long as it's done under NATO's umbrella and US umbrella. And Australia now, if you read the Australian media, they are actually pushing down war-footing propaganda to the Australian people and telling them to prepare war, not against Russia, but against China. And China is the other angle of this entire episode. That what the United States is planning, according to all their strategies that you can read, the ultimate aim is a war with China. And the war with China is because China is beating the United States economically, technologically. Except for a naval facility in Somalia, China has no bases abroad. And Russia has only one in the entire Mediterranean region, in Syria, while the United States has over 800 military bases. 400 of them are surrounding China. So this war over the Ukraine is but the most dangerous first step towards a world war. They are threatening the world and China and the rest of the world with war. And when they talk about the international community, that's another BBC buzzword, international, 2 words. International community. If you count China, India, Brazil, and Egypt, and other large nations, that is more than half the world. And if you count the whole of Africa, Latin America, and so on, you're talking about 80% of the world population is not counted in this phrase, international community. That's even if we accept the 20% it's most of us even within the 20%. So what they are talking about when they say international community is the leaders in Washington, London, some in Paris, some in Berlin or Japan or Australia or some in New Zealand. So really we need to decipher a lot of this stuff that's being thrown at us, that this war is very, very dangerous, and that at the heart of it is the economic crisis. And this is something they rarely link the 2 issues together. And this is something we should all be aware of. And Sarah referred to that briefly, that this crisis is usually, looking back at history, this type of crisis does lead to wars, unfortunately. Because the system itself cannot survive without war. Our system, our basis of technology, militarization, oil production, our influence abroad depends on our military prowess, military expansion. Our economy depends on it. As British people, we need to also recognize the role of Britain in the world, how we participated, how we created some of these problems. And it's about time we dissociate from the United States and what they are doing to the world. Otherwise, they will drag us into more wars, more catastrophes. And we must, at all costs, be active to try and stop escalation to war. Thank you.
Thank you, Sami. That was an excellent analysis as ever. So our next speaker is, that's right, Orlando de Rocha from Brazil, who can now give a South American perspective on the situation at the moment. As Sami was saying, probably 80% of the world is not part of this international community that we hear about so much.
My name's Orlando Hill. I took part in Lula's campaign, recent campaign for president, and I've been backing on it since the very beginning. Now, Lula's policy, foreign policy, represents a departure from the previous governments. It's much more focused on the global south, building a plural world, instead of this bipolar world that the US tries to develop, the UK too. And it is in strengthening ties with South America, with the global south, with African countries, Asian countries. Different from his previous, which was much more dealing with European countries and the EU and the US. Now Lula, during his campaign, he was interviewed by the Time magazine, and they asked him directly about Ukraine. And his position was that Ukraine, Zelensky, is as much to blame for the war as Russia. That it was wrong for NATO to expand. And he even quotes here that we politicians reap what we sow. If I sow fraternity, solidarity, and harmony, I will reap good things. If I sow discord, I will reap quarrels. Putin shouldn't have invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is a member of the United Nations and has the right to its territory. However, the US and the UN and the European Union are also guilty. I mean, what was the reason for the war? If it was NATO, the US and the European Union should have said, okay, Ukraine won't join NATO, and the problem would have been solved. And he also blamed Zelensky a lot in his interview, that instead of going around having like an electoral campaign, going to Europe, speaking to Germany and so on, what he should have been doing is sitting down negotiating peace with Russia. And then the Time magazine said, well, how do you negotiate with 100,000 troops on your border? And he said, well, you don't just take one day to negotiate. Negotiate a peace is a matter of patience. You negotiate, if it takes months, you sit down and negotiate. But what you don't do is keep expanding NATO and you negotiate peace. Brazil does not want to see a weakened Russia. That's not good for the world, it's not good for any attempt of weakening countries, as we've seen previously with Iraq, with Iran, with any attempt to try to weaken countries. It just causes more confusion. So, I mean, what is the solution in this moment? And what Brazil points out is that what we have to do is a group of countries for peace, like a G20 for peace. Countries that are willing to negotiate peace, and countries that can talk to both NATO and to Russia. And these countries, and he points out a group of countries. It would be Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and Indonesia. These are countries that have no quarrel with either companies, without either countries, and will be able to sit down and to talk peace with these countries. And I think kind of suits what the Stop the War and CND are defending. No to NATO, no to Russian invasion, because you don't do that, and no to NATO expansion. And peace talks now. That is exactly what the Brazilian government its foreign policy is demanding. And as Sandy pointed out, this is exactly what the true international community wants. So I think that's the important thing about showing that there is another perspective. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Orlando. That was great. Our next speaker is Hussein Ali from Islamic Human Rights Commission. Hussein, thank you very much for coming.
Today I'm going to talk a bit about what NATO is basically from a Muslim perspective, how we perceive NATO, because we have had actual experience with NATO in the past, and it's not been a great experience, to put it that way. The fact that no one really wants to admit and no one really wants to mention when we talk about NATO, we can call it the imperialist countries. NATO is there for one reason alone, to keep Europe and the white people in control of the world. Therefore, we see it as the army of global white supremacy. This is something that a lot of people don't like to talk about, because sometimes it's seen as a divisive topic to talk about, and we do feel like it can alienate some of our allies who might not want to use certain language. I think we have to also look at the other aspect, which is the effect that capitalism has on the situation. America is obviously an extreme capitalist country. It is controlled by corporations. The biggest industry in America, or at least one of the biggest, is war. It is weapons selling, and therefore they need to keep war continuously going on. This is why they send billions to Israel. Most of that money will get spent on weapons, taxpayers' money, and it just gets recycled back to American companies, mostly making lots and lots of money out of their own taxpayer to the suffering of the Palestinians. By joining NATO, you have to put a certain percentage of your spending every year on weapons. This is one of the rules for joining NATO. So that's one of the aspects that we have to look at. Now, we've known NATO. My grandfather was lived in Libya. We have a lot of connections, family connections to Libya. NATO came and destroyed Libya. It brought nothing good for Libya. I remember having a discussion with another gentleman at one time about, he was saying, well, the situation in Libya was bad at the time. Well, we're supposed to do nothing. But if there's a fire in your house and the only liquid you have to douse that fire with is oil, you don't pour oil on the fire. It just doesn't make sense. Within our community, one of the huge things that this war has done in Ukraine is show the hypocrisy of how it's been portrayed. The racism behind the way that this war has been portrayed in comparison to, say, Palestine or Yemen or what's happening in the Muslim world. When they say on the news, victims with blonde hair, blue eyes, this was a huge controversy in the Muslim community, because it was like, they were basically saying, these people matter more than us, and actually saying it. They weren't just doing it slyly, it was the actual language that was coming out from these people. We've been, we could say crying for a long time over Palestine, over Yemen. We've been asking for sanctions on these countries. We've been crying over Kashmir for a long time, and we've been pushing and we feel like we get nowhere, and then all of a sudden, within 5 minutes of this war, everyone's putting these sanctions onto Russia. So I think the attitude in the Muslim world, from what I get, I was in Indonesia recently, and I wasn't in Egypt, but I'm in contact a lot with people in Egypt as well. Is they don't really know who's right or wrong in in the Russia-Ukraine. They don't get involved, they just look at the hypocrisy of it all. And they're like, why should we care? And I think this is an attitude that's coming out of a lot of Africa, I've been hearing, is a lot of countries in Africa are just like, we don't want to get involved in your problems. You know, you never cared about our problems, you never cared about our wars, so why should we care about yours? We also look at the way that people have been running off to, when people run off to the Muslim world and join terrorist organisations, the way they're portrayed in comparison to the way that people running off to join neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine have been portrayed in the media. This has been a huge hypocrisy again that we've noticed and that we've spoken about. That's not to say saying that it's bad that these people go in there to defend Ukraine. Again, I'm not going to get involved in the politics today. I just want to talk about the actual portrayal and how it looks to us and our perceptions. We see them painted as heroes, going there defending themselves from all this sort of thing. When Muslims are running off, joining groups, some of which are funded by the West and which are supported by the West. I'm not talking just about Daesh, I'm talking about the so-called moderate rebels. And then these people, they run off and join these groups, but they're portrayed as terrorists. When they come back, they get a completely different perception towards them. So again, it's the hypocrisy that really comes out on this war. Is people watch BBC and CNN, or they watch RT and other Russian things, which are so completely different to each other that there can be no sort of middle ground, no sort of discussion. It's just your side is all propaganda, you're just brainwashed. And I think we need to look at war is the failure of politics, when politics has failed. We need to understand that the sovereignty of Ukraine, the security of Russia, and the rights of the people in East Ukraine, whether Ukrainian or the minorities, as East Ukraine is very multicultural. So I think these three things all need to be taken into account and understood. If you want peace, you have to listen to the other side and you have to understand. And I feel now we're seeing the world turn into a bipolar world, where it's just one set of views, where now RT is being banned in this country. As far as I know, BBC is being banned in Russia. So views are going to start going apart. They've really pushed hard on Russia, pushing hard now on China, pushing hard on Iran. And this has forced these countries to start working together. If you've noticed, Iran was in China last week. The president of Iran was visiting China. Putin is now visiting China. Iran went to Venezuela the week before and just signed stronger deals. It's pushing these countries together and creating a very bipolar world. And I think this is to counteract the rise of China, which right now America realizes it can't keep full hegemony over the world as it believed it would at the end of the Cold War. And I think now they're pushing it, rather split the world into two than allow a one globalized world if they can't control it. Thank you for having me again. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. Yes, you did raise new things, particularly the whole issue of the racism, of the way that the refugees from one war are treated compared with another. Taking questions and contributions from the audience.
Since there's a military dimension to this, it's worth mentioning that before a general of the British Army fights a battle, he has to fill in a form, and the first section is intentions of the enemy. Now, as far as I'm concerned, our enemy are the people in charge in the United States and Britain. And I think what's been lacking is a clear delineation of what their intentions have been and are. As far as I can see, there are three things. One is to break up a possible economic understanding between Germany and Russia. Secondly, to get rid of Putin. And thirdly, more long term, to break up the Russian Federation into 5 separate small states. So I'd like people to comment on that.
The Hungarian Foreign Ministry recently had to issue a statement saying they're finding it extremely difficult to continue to support Ukraine because of the treatment of Hungarian people, and many of the same things, the removal of language rights, violence, and so on. Anecdotally, I've heard that the same thing happens to Romanians, and that ethnic minorities are being targeted in the gangs, in the press gangs that are roaming Ukrainian cities at the moment, snatching people off the streets and sending them into the army. So the only thing that will help the people in Ukraine is peace. And the only way that's going to happen is these peace talks, because if continue on, there will be no Ukrainians left. It'll be hollow victory. Thank you.
I'm from South Africa. We openly say we will not support the sanctions because of the hypocrisy and double standards. We know that apartheid was supported and propped up by the West. That Russia, despite, I'm not a Stalinist, I do not support Stalin, but Russia supported us. They gave us education, they gave us arms, and they supported us throughout the time when the West played games. So asking the people in the global south to support a war that we know we don't support, we know what's happening, because at the moment, the people who are suffering the most are again the global south. The grain crisis, the oil crisis, the energy crisis, it's always us. Climate change, it's us. Millions of us are dying now.
We were told that these sanctions would de-escalate the conflict in some course of de-escalation of the conflict would mean Russia would withdraw, and it's almost, it hasn't worked whatsoever, and these sanctions have only hurt everyone else since they've let the work pass.
NATO's reason for existing was supposedly, to stand up against the USSR. Well, the USSR hasn't been around since 1991, but NATO is still here with us today, and they're trying to expand it. They're trying to expand it out of the North Atlantic. They're trying to expand it, to basically include Australia, and to kind of hook up with, is Japan? They're trying to get Japan as some sort of member. So basically, they're just trying to surround China. And if we don't stop them now, they will cause a war, a world war.
I've edited pamphlets, I've been on multiple demonstrations against NATO and its policies from Libya to Ukraine and elsewhere. But today, as we've seen and as it's happened on both sides, but today I saw some pictures of a Russian rocket hitting a bus stop in Kherson. And as an anti-war activist, I can't watch that, look at a picture of a bus stop where 5 civilians have been killed and say, that's okay because of geopolitics. As an anti-war activist, I look at that and I say that's wrong because I'm against war and I want both sides to de-escalate the war. But that wasn't my main point. I am as much for disbanding NATO as anyone, but that doesn't mean that I can't criticise the Russian invasion. I can look at it both ways.
It's not a question of supporting Russia or not supporting Russia. It's a question of understanding what's happened and why it's happened. And the failure of the West, the failure of Ukraine, not just a failure, but the deliberate undermining of the Minsk agreements by the West, which has created the situation that now obtains. And Angela Merkel and Stolz and now Naftali Bennett from Israel have made it perfectly clear the West were never serious about the Minsk agreements. They always saw it as a way of giving Ukraine time to arm. That's what they saw it as. It's completely deceptive. And it means that who can Russia trust now to go into negotiations with? I think that's a very serious problem.
I'm not a Putinist. I'm not saying that Russia is completely innocent, but clearly Russia was grossly provoked. And I think that it's absolutely essential to say no to NATO. Why the hell do we still have NATO? It's 30 years past its sell-by date.
NATO was founded before the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a response to NATO, and if you look at the history, NATO recruited a whole lot of Nazi war leaders into their ranks. In 1961, the head of NATO, or chief officer, was an ex-Nazi. Let's have no illusions about what NATO is and why it must be disbanded. Its agenda has been this. People have given lots of evidence about that, and I'd add to it that the evidence that Boris Johnson went over there to scupper any agreement right in the early stages of the war agenda. And I mean, one of my questions is around, this is a crisis for the EU, I think. You've got Germany, you've got the rest of the EU totally subservient to NATO. Now maybe they have always been that way, but this is a crisis. Who is suffering economically, apart from the rest of the world, apart from Ukraine, obviously, and Russians? It's a total crisis, but I'm interested to hear people's views on that.
Thank you everyone for those contributions, and I'd just like to say that the question is not, do you think Russia was right or wrong to invade? It's, do you think it was inevitable? When you look at what was happening, what else did anybody expect to happen? And there has to be a call for peace. There has to be a call for negotiation and not supplying any more arms and stopping all this scuppering of peace deals. I'm going to come back to the speakers now to answer the various points and questions that were raised.
I was in Greece about 10, 15 years ago, when I was quite young, with the children of partisans who had fought against, first they fought against Nazi Germany, or first they fought against Mussolini, then Nazi Germany, then the Brits, and then finally the Americans. There, it was a similar situation where the Nazis had been freed by the Brits when they came in. They took the Nazis out of the prisons that had been defeated by the partisans, the rebels who had been fighting in Greece, and built them into an army to fight their interests in Greece, to destroy what effectively had been a government created there. This is considered the first war of the Cold War, the beginning of the Cold War. It was when Truman wrote I think it's the Truman Doctrine or whatnot, was based on Greece. So I think it's something that will always be repeated, and I think there's a lot of nationalism now all across the former Soviet Union, in Ukraine and in Russia, which has played a large part in this war. And that is the result of, again, the West trying to break up the Soviet Union and pushing nationalists further into the Soviet Union at the time when they were pushing elections. And once again, the West actions, they do get their aim contributed to, and then they have no interest in what happens after that, and it's the people of that country or countries as it became that suffer. This is what we saw in Libya when NATO came. You cannot blame Russia. I'm not saying whether they were right or wrong to invade, but it was inevitable they were going to invade. If you put NATO on their border, there's no way it was not going to happen eventually. Not expect any other result from what was happening. Anyway.
I'd like to first answer the question about the breakup of Russia into 5 small states. That is not in the interest of anyone. Any weakened country, we've seen what happens when you weaken countries, like what happened in Syria, what happened in Iraq. Weakened countries just build more war. And for Brazil, it's not in Brazil's interest. For a very pragmatic reason is that Brazil depends on Russian fertilizers for its agribusiness. And Brazil's position on this is to strengthen BRICS. Weakening Russia also goes against Lula's whole world viewpoint of having a polar world. From Brazil's point of view and from the global south, it would be better to have a stronger European Union, independent of the United States, forming a different pole. And even better if it left NATO. And about restoring the Minsk agreement, that would be a brilliant way of starting peace talks. I think China's got a peace plan for the peace talks, which could be used. So I think there are peace talks now. When I go leafleting for Stop the War, people ask me, well, how is it possible? I think Brazil, China, Indonesia, Mexico, and the vast majority of the international community have it very clear of how that is possible. It's not a fantasy or a fairy tale or anything. Peace talks are possible, and I think what we have to pressurize, now I'm speaking as a British citizen, What we have to pressurize our government in the UK is to accept these peace talks.
On the nature of the war today in the Ukraine, I fully agree with the formulation that it's a proxy war, and it's a US-led, NATO-executed proxy war against Russia. This is, I think this is very clear to me, despite what I think about the invasion by Russia and so on, and I stated my view on that very clearly, but Russia and the Russian people will have to be careful because the United States is in a sense a wounded power. The US empire is on the wane, and empires on the wane become extremely dangerous. So really this is, it's capitalism in crisis, and capitalism in crisis is very dangerous. World War II was about that, and so was World War I. So we have to realize that this is a quite dangerous situation. On the question of the rise of fascism and racism, because Ukraine, as some people mentioned, was immediately portrayed as a war, Russian war against people with blue eyes and white, and so on. That was a BBC reporter giving it that racist dimension. And the rise of fascist forces not only in Ukraine, although in Ukraine they were fully armed and were more recently incorporated into the official Ukrainian army, but there is a rise of fascist forces across Europe. Sanctions on Russia, I think I said US-led proxy war against Russia, and sanctions are a form of war today. Any country they want to attack today, they start with sanctions. They did it across the board, and they are doing it against Venezuela. They started with Cuba, actually, 1959. These sanctions lead to deaths. They killed 500,000 Iraqi children, according to the United Nations. Between 1991 and 2003, 500,000 Iraqi children died because of sanctions. They're killing Iranian children. Syria is suffering enormously now from a massive earthquake, and Britain still applies sanctions on Syria. How are you going to send help to Syria victims if you're applying? Sanctions are a part of this US-led war across the world. There isn't a single legal sanction today, by the way. They are all illegal, internationally illegal, whether against Russia, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, and so on, because none of them are UN-approved sanctions. So they are all internationally illegal, and they are actually declarations of war against many of the countries of the world, especially in the global south. Somebody mentioned peace plan. Yes, China is going to announce a peace plan in the next few days, I think this week. So hopefully that will sort of push the NATO aggressors and the United States into isolation politically. Minsk was mentioned. Yes, the Minsk agreement, according to Merkel, she officially said that we did it so that we buy time. So they had no intention. And the Minsk agreement was supposed to protect the Russian ethnic minorities and Crimean people. The Minsk agreement was signed between the Ukraine and Russia, and it was approved by the EU and so on. But it turned out they were just... Sorry? And the United Nations, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It was an internationally ratified, if you like, agreement, absolutely. And Merkel, only 2-3 weeks ago, declared that it was merely to buy time so that they could arm Ukraine and so on. So clearly, this is a critical juncture, and maybe I said enough. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. You never say too much. And thank you to all the speakers. I think all the contributions have been great, and the audience as well.